Welcome back to the Frontier Faith Podcast. I'm Mike.
And I'm Jeff, and today Mike is going to teach us everything we've ever wanted to know about Melchizedek. From Hebrews chapter 7, as you know, we've been going through the book of Hebrews and just really focusing in on Jesus and how the Hebrews author highlights how Jesus is greater than everything. And so we've looked at a handful of themes so far in this book, how Jesus is greater than angels, greater than Moses, greater than Joshua, how Jesus is our high priest and how he functions as our leader, leading us through the wilderness. And a couple times so far in the book of Hebrews, the author's kind of glanced or mentioned or just had a nod to Melchizedek. But in this chapter, he just goes all in on him. So we're gonna explore this chapter. Melchizedek is an interesting figure in the book of Genesis, and it talks some about that. But before we kind of talk about the sections here in this chapter, I'm just curious. I know you preached through this chapter a couple weeks ago. How did you approach this chapter overall? If you were to have a central point, or what did you want the church here to take home?
That Jesus is our ultimate salvation and that he is in a permanent position. And there's been a lot of things kind of leading up to the position of Jesus. And now that he is in that role, there's things are locked in.
Mm-hmm.
And recognizing just the permanency of Jesus' role as high priest.
Okay. So I'm curious, before we read, was there anything after your deep study of this and preparing the sermon that came out that you're like, I never thought about that before, or I never studied that before? Or because this is a interesting chapter. And again, for many of us, if we just read through the book of Hebrews for the first time, we might just come to this name we don't know how to pronounce. But was there, and it's okay if not, but is there anything that, typically one of my favorite take-home lessons when I took some preaching courses in different schools, they always tell you preach to yourself first. Mm-hmm. So I'm curious, as Mike the student, Mike the disciple, is there anything from this chapter you're that you heard preach?
Yeah, a handful of things, and some of we'll get into as we're going through it. But from bird's eye view of it, I was really moved to see God making these really broad stroke movements. And so God is always involved in everything.
That's right.
And through him, all things hold together. But there's these moments where it's if you're building a house, when you put the roof on, mm-hmm. It's here's this big moment of this is a big part of the house. And there's certain stages that once it's in place, you don't take it off again. It's now there to stay. And so looking through this chapter, you see some things God has done that isn't just his daily interaction with humanity and guiding and overseeing and judging and ruling, but you see the works of his hand in the establishing Jesus in this role, this order of priest of Melchizedek. And so you see him making changes and implementing things that are now eternal. So seeing an earthquake, the Richter scale, there's some big moving pieces with this, and it's putting a big exclamation point at the end of Jesus's name. It's this is so huge. And it's don't miss it. Don't miss what just happened a few decades earlier.
Yeah.
The recipients of this letter. So learning about the Lord swearing, and him taking this oath, as he gets into it in this way.
Mm-hmm.
And then also just the priesthood of Melchizedek. There are some things about that I had not really heard or dug into before. The example of God having servants outside of just the house of Israel, as God has always cared about all people everywhere. He used Israel for a specific task, but whether it's Melchizedek or whether it's Jethro, the priest of Midian, you have these individuals that are not under the umbrella of Abraham that are in these roles of representing God to people.
Right.
And that there is this relationship God has with having a care for all humanity. That's not something new. It's something that's now greatly emphasized. God has always cared about everyone everywhere.
Yeah. Big major themes there that I'm excited to get into. It's just cool so far to see in the book of Hebrews how the author is demonstrating the fulfillment found in Jesus, anticipated in the Hebrew scriptures. But what's interesting so far is that overall, he's taking some major categories or characters or people and demonstrating how Jesus is better than them. Of course, angels were a major part of the Jewish faith. Moses himself, Joshua, the wilderness episode, and those are major. Melchizedek was minor, uh, but yet discussed at length in Jewish tradition. Lots of, who's this guy? And so it's interesting how the Hebrews author is going to even demonstrate how Jesus fulfills every corner of the Old Testament. So let's get into it. First few verses introduces Melchizedek. It says, for this Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of the Most High God, met Abraham returning from the slaughter of the kings and blessed him. And to him, Abraham apportioned a 10th part of everything. He is first, by translation of his name, king of righteousness, and then he is also king of Salem, that is, king of peace. He is without father or mother or genealogy, having neither beginning of days nor end of life, but resembling the Son of God, he continues a priest forever. Okay, help us out here.
So the only time you see Melchizedek in person in the Old Testament is in Genesis 14.
Okay.
And it's when Abraham goes on this rescue mission, him and his boys, and he gets a crew together of 100 odd people. And these men go and they slaughter these kings and people, and they rescue Lot, and they rescue these other captives from this epic hostage situation. But it's like a war hostage situation. And Abraham's victorious. And so he's carrying all these spoils from slaughtering these enemies. And then seemingly out of nowhere, there is this individual, Melchizedek. He comes out to meet him. And he is the king, another king, in this nearby city, the king of Salem. That place, Salem, the location where this is all happening, this is ancient Jerusalem. So that's where he gets the name, Jerusalem. And so David didn't build Jerusalem. He gets established in Jerusalem, but that city had been there way, 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 way back. And Melchizedek goes out and meets Abraham, and Abraham has this huge showing of deference where he meets Melchizedek. Melchizedek brings out bread and wine for everybody, which is pretty interesting symbolism. Save that for later. I've seen this before.
For sure.
Yes, literally. And Abraham then gives him a 10th of all the spoils. And that's going to come up in this chapter as a big point of Abraham showing submission and deference to Melchizedek, and that Melchizedek is greater than that. So he has these really distinctive roles of king of not just the city of Salem. He's the king of righteousness itself, the king of peace itself. He's also the king of the city. And his role in that function of king, this idea of not having genealogy, not having a mother or father, is that he is in this role not by inheritance. He wasn't born into it. He wasn't voted into office. He didn't conquer the city and then get it. He is a priest king that is in this dynamic directly by the hand of God. God has just appointed him openly into this role. And so it's by God alone and directly that he has this position. And so it's not something that his descendants just get. It's not something he got through his ancestors.
Right.
It's not, there's nobody else better. He's the really smart one. So it's an extension of God's will for him to be there. And so resembling the Son of God is something really important to lock in here, that he has a lot of similarities to Jesus to help us have some type of recognition. But there's so many different theories about Melchizedek. He's conjured up so many different wild ideas. And I think he's intentionally supposed to be an enigma in some ways. And you see his character actually inspired a lot of other fictional characters, like Tom Bombadil,
Yeah.
Lord of the Rings, and several others. Where like, who is this guy? This guy is a big somebody, but you don't get all the details about him, and then we still don't get all the details about him specifically. But what we do get is his role is really important. His backstory isn't important, but what's important is his role and function in God's plan and purposes. And so you have kind of three different ideas about him that I've found that really I've heard of two of them. One of them I didn't know about. There's something interesting with who is Melchizedek. And one big theory is that some people think that Melchizedek is the pre-incarnate Christ. That he's Jesus, kind of like Joshua seeing the commander of the Lord's armies, or Abraham with the visitors, where you have this potential moment where this is Jesus before he was born through Mary. I don't think that's the case here, because here it says he resembles the Son of God, is the Son of God. So also to have a whole life as king there, not just as a visitor.
Right.
I appear to think is a very different statement. But that's a theory some people have. Another one, this is one I didn't know about, is some people think that Melchizedek is actually Shem, the son of Noah. But you look at the genealogy and the timelines, and Noah himself actually dies when Abraham is about 60. So going forward from then, Shem would have been alive at this time. He would have lived even a few more centuries past this point. So they infer that because he was kind of a faithful line, and that he was having been with Noah, surviving the flood, having this relationship with God. There's some extra biblical writings centuries later that hint or say or suggest that Shem is Melchizedek. So I think it's very possible Shem was alive at this time, but I think it's a big stretch to have Shem and Melchizedek overlap, because one of the big points of Melchizedek being in this role is that he's not there through ancestry or accomplishment, or faithfulness, really even. He's there because God appoints him to be that. So seeing that display that God can choose somebody to like really fully represent him to humanity, and it's a priesthood that you just are, doesn't have weekends.
Yeah.
It just is, and it lasts forever. But as we're going to say in this chapter, humans on our own don't last forever. This priesthood lasts forever.
Yeah.
Which is why you combine that with an eternal life, then you have something really that's going to change everything.
Interesting. A lot of threads to pull here. But first of all, I think it's interesting how you mentioned different theories, because that is a pretty common thing in intertestamental period and first few centuries. There's a lot of questions that come up when you read the Bible. Who is that? What happened there? And for instance, as an example, you can see a lot of pseudepigraphal writings come out that just kind of theorize Jesus' early childhood.
Sure.
Like, what was like 13-year-old Jesus like, and let's write a story about it, But that comes from curiosity.
Yeah.
And that was true in the intertestamental period with the Hebrew scriptures as well. That's why you have writings of Melchizedek, because the Bible is intentionally vague about him, because it's planting a seed for later. But there's several. One thing we need to remember, just as an aside, in the Hebrew Bible is that the Hebrew Bible is zeroed in on one family. You have that major shift in Genesis 1-11. We have this cosmic view, and then you have one man, Abram, who's called, and the rest of the Bible is kind of following his story to see how God fulfills his promise in order to bless all nations. The end goal is for all nations. We see that fulfilled in Christ. But along the journey, along the storyline of the Bible, of the Hebrew scriptures, you see like these little nods and asides to the nations, where you mentioned that earlier, where there's maybe individuals who kind of come into the storyline, and like Jethro, and God is using people. He uses pagan leaders like Cyrus to release those people. He sends prophets he sends Jonah to Nineveh.
Right.
God has always been a God of all nations. and he's using an elect Israel for that. But because of that focus, there's a lot of things not written. We would love to hear the backstory. The Hebrews author is telling us, well, this is why he's in Genesis, because he's pointing to something greater. A couple things here. I appreciate what you said about verse 3. Without father or mother, as a teenager, I was so confused. I was like, you just like pop here. It's like, what? But you're right. It's, and as we get to this next section, the way he's put into contrast with particularly Levi, that's kind of the priesthood was all about genealogy and lineage.
And a quick explanation further on that too. It's very Jewish and traditional to say, like, if someone is an orphan, that he is fatherless or motherless.
Yeah.
And so,
that's on.
Obviously, they didn't spontaneously show up, but it is like on a social level,
right?
They are without father and mother.
That's good.
It's not level.
Yeah.
So
great example.
So just to further just lock that in, that he's not spontaneously existing. He's just in this role, not through hereditary or accomplishment.
Yeah. Two things before we go on. One, I find it important at the end of verse 3 that he says that Melchizedek resembles the Son of God, not the Son of God resembling Melchizedek.
Yes.
Because the way he's been playing so far, I say playing, but the way he's been, his structure so far in Hebrews is to say, here's the example from the Hebrew Bible, Moses, and here's how Jesus fulfills that or is greater than that. But he just makes it very clear that even way back then, Melchizedek, in that order, it resembled something greater. Like, it's not that Jesus later becomes greater. Even in its origin, it resembled something more eternal and greater. So resembling the Son of God. The second thing I'm curious just to hear more, because I think it's going to be important, is as the Hebrews author soon compares Melchizedek and Jesus together, I'm curious to hear more from you about the importance of these words, peace and righteousness, because he talks about having a king of righteousness. And it says, he is first by translation of his name, king of righteousness. So the word Melchizedek is the combination of two Hebrew words, melech, which means king, and tzedek, which means righteousness, translated other ways. But typically in the Hebrew scriptures, tzedek is like righteousness or in the way or whatever. So in his name is like king of righteousness, and he is king over Salem, which means peace. Those are important and they're like built into his function and his office. But clearly the Hebrews author brings those two words up for a reason. And I'm curious and maybe he does later in this chapter, why are those two words important for the Hebrews author to highlight here?
I think it shows like Jesus, and one of Jesus' titles, like the Prince of Peace.
Right.
And so you're in this role and you're more than just like a virtuous magistrate.
Yeah.
You are a like avatar of God.
Mm-hmm.
And you have a he's not just a righteous king, he's not just a peaceful king,
yeah.
He is the king of these things.
Mm-hmm.
And I think he embodies those things, he represents those things to people. And so, like in certain shows and movies, you have certain characters that are kind of the moral compass of the group, the Captain America, Cyclops, you have Superman.
Mm-hmm.
Those are the guys in their respective groups. They're like, you can trust that they got their heads on straight and they're going to be kind of the Boy Scouts of the. So I think him being the king of righteousness, king of peace, is that for the world at that time, there was somebody that you could look to like, okay, they know what's up. They know God's view of righteousness and God's heart on what peace is.
He resembles the Son of God.
For the Father and I are one. Melchizedek is not Christ,
right? But
he's in a similar role with that Christ. He resembles the role, and it's a big deal. With Jethro being the only other plausible, possible example of this outside of Jesus, you have this representation of God with man as a man amongst people. And peace and righteousness both are kind of two sides of the same coin of the very good of Eden, where this is as God designs it to be. And that's why it's good, because this is God's will being fulfilled. So him being the King of righteousness and King of peace, he's helping rule over those things and establish those things around him, and being a big signpost world pointing towards the Creator.
Yeah. I heard a lesson a couple weeks ago about Paul's line, "He who knew no sin became sin, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God." And the speaker was emphasizing that he doesn't say that he who knew no sin became sin so that we might become righteous, so that we might become the righteousness of God, and how the righteousness of God is a key part of his character, and it's attributed to Jesus specifically as it is the instrument through which God is making the world right again. And so whether themes of justice and peace and shalom, right, are all found in Jesus. And that's not a New Testament thing, because the King of Salem was resembling the Son of God all the way back then. And so starts talking about his faith and comparing him to Levi. So I'm excited to talk about this. It says, "See how great this man was."
In case you missed it.
See how great he is.
See it. See how great this man was, to whom Abraham, the patriarch, gave a tenth of his spoils. And those descendants of Levi who receive the priestly office have a commandment in the law to take tithes from the people, that is, from their brothers, though these also are descended from Abraham. But this man, who does not have his descent from them, received tithes from Abraham and blessed him who had the promises. It is beyond dispute that the inferior is blessed by the superior. In the one case, tithes are received by mortal men, but in the other case, by one of whom it is testified that he lives. One might even say that Levi himself, who receives tithes, paid tithes through Abraham, for he was still in the loins of his ancestor when Melchizedek met him. That dude, I'm sorry, the Hebrews author, this guy, whoever wrote this, he knows how to argue. He's point.
He does.
So why talk about Levi? Why is this important here?
So Abraham is like the patriarch.
Right. That's what he even says. The patriarch.
Yeah. He's the guy.
Yeah.
You know, when Jesus is arguing with the Jews, you're fathered the devil. I don't know. Or fathered Abraham. And so they put a lot of stock and identity in being offspring of Abraham. And the author making a point like, look at who your patriarch bowed down to.
Mm-hmm.
And so because Abraham bowed down, he's greater than all of his descendants, he wants to highlight one of his descendants is also Levi. So Abraham and all descendants under him are of lower standing than Melchizedek. So all Jews and also the priesthood of the Jews are playing second fiddle to Melchizedek. Melchizedek is greater than Abraham, and he's greater than his descendants. And this idea of blessing is really special, because you have Abraham give a blessing, you have Isaac, give blessing, he gets deceived and visit to Jacob, visit Esau, and then you have Israel give his blessing to all of his. So there's different kinds of blessing in the Old Testament, where you have the idea of like, bless the Lord, oh my soul, and you speak blessing, and you speak truth and encouragement and love, and that's like this blessing. There's also this other blessing of like empowered favor and focus and like responsibility and participation in God's will. So Abraham being blessed by Melchizedek is showing that like Melchizedek is like another higher patriarchal order than himself. And so that blessing relationship, just like he points out here, makes it without any doubt that Abraham is subordinate to Melchizedek.
It's just interesting, though, that Abraham takes this initiative in the bowing down. Like it's one thing for the kingdom of righteousness to expect this, this, what we just read, this tithing. But Abram takes it, right? He takes the initiative here in offering and I don't know, I mean, we don't know a lot. We don't know a lot of what was Abraham's motive in it, but
seems like it was a natural response when Melchizedek comes out to meet him, that Abraham just knows this is like, it's like you stand up and the president walks in. Like, this is the right thing to do. And so there is I would say intuitive, but it's just already known and established. It's not like Paul running his mouth, getting slapped, and then realizing he's talking to the high priest. I'm so sorry. I didn't know I was talking to the high priest. Or else I wouldn't have called you whitewashed. So it seemed like it was pretty clear who's who at that time.
Yeah. So it's interesting just thinking about the purpose of bringing up Melchizedek in the first place, because we're going to get to, it's all about Jesus, right?
And that promise that Melchizedek is blessing him with is showing the promise. And so when there's this blessing, it's like gaining momentum. It's like adding more weight to the momentum of the promise coming into fruition. So Melchizedek blessing Abraham is an important point of Melchizedek is the one that helps set this into motion of the seed of Abraham being the blessing to the whole world. And when there's this blessing in this way, this person, Melchizedek, is being directly utilized to carry out God's big plan. So it wasn't to tackle one particular circumstance, is that Melchizedek is present and is also kind of the kickoff for this seed blessing which started in the garden or outside the garden. The links of the chain is not just Noah to Abraham or Abraham and her just getting this calling, but you have this blessing from Melchizedek where you see this like sanctioned by God for this to happen.
Yeah. And thinking about the Jewish audience of this letter, he goes on to compare it. The whole point, I think, was to get to Levi was in the loins, which is a weird way to say it, but he's just describing that, like you said, everyone that came from Abraham, from his seed, from his loins, everyone which is not a weird way for them to think about it, weird for us maybe, but, everyone, because genealogy is so important.
Sure.
That everyone who's come from Father Abraham is bowing down, but he resembles the Son of God. But I think the whole point was to get to the priesthood, right? Because as he can go even into chapter 8, it's talking about the priesthood of Jesus, and I think trying to make an argument for how in the world someone from Judah can be our high priest. So in verse 11, if perfection had been attainable through the Levitical priesthood, for under it the people received the law, what further need would there have been for another priest to arise after the order of Melchizedek, rather than one named after the order of Aaron? For when there is a change in the priesthood, there is necessarily a change in the law as well. For the one of whom these things are spoken belonged to another tribe, from which no one has ever served at the altar. For it is evident that our Lord was descended from Judah, and in connection with that tribe, Moses said nothing about priests. Yeah, so is that his whole point, is to get to like how our priest comes from the line of Judah?
It's definitely a good point, and something that's constant in Hebrews is the compare and contrast in Jesus and other holy things. And so the Levitical priesthood, really big deal, fundamental part of Jewish life. And what we're seeing here is that the Levitical priesthood was never sufficient. It was important, but it's like an X-ray for a doctor's office. Like this is a useful, necessary tool to get to a certain point, but the X-ray doesn't heal. The law was created perfect, but it is broken in its faulty in its ability to save. And so Melchizedek was always needed. And God's been saying it all along that the law alone was not sufficient to accomplish his will entirely. The law couldn't go the distance in bringing to fruition what God ultimately wants. And it's important too with these verses. I think is one of the big points of Hebrews is that Jesus changes everything. And there's this new covenant with Jesus that is not like covenant 2.0. It's not just a remix of the covenant. It's not the old and new covenant combined into some like yin yang, like super covenant. The old has been fulfilled and then it's obsolete and no longer in function. It's no longer functioning. There's now a new covenant that's established, the new priesthood. I think this is probably the toughest pill to swallow in the book for the recipients of just if you have thousands of years of tradition, culture, religion, practice, care for this covenant, which wasn't the old covenant until there's this new covenant, just the covenant. And there's now this language of that it can't save. And later on, we're going to see that obsolete. And just like it's these cherished things. And God made the law, He didn't mess up in making the law. It's just that the law was never going to be a permanent implementation, and that what is established though in Jesus is a forever dynamic. And that's what I was talking about for one of the big revelations for me in reading through Hebrews this time around preaching through it is seeing how the new covenant is crafted in eternal material, whereas the law was crafted on stone.
Yeah. The one way the Levitical priesthood would have been, perfect and attainable is if we just lived perfectly and did everything right, But there's this sin problem that clings so closely that a new covenant was needed. It's interesting because the law we're going to talk more about this in the next chapter for sure, but, the law, the people of God viewed it as a beautiful, good thing. You see Paul in that language, but like David, I meditate on your law day and night. It's like, well, the reason it was so beautiful and sweet was in contrast to Israel's pagan neighbors. You have flippant gods who are not clear in their communication, supposedly. Obviously, they're not real, but it's like, man, it hasn't rained in 3 months. What are we doing wrong? And then just kind of, maybe I need to kill my kid. It's just like the sacrifices, like all sorts of stuff. Whereas God has rescued the people from Egypt. He brought them through Sinai, and He's formed them, right? And He's created. And the whole second half of the book of Exodus, the whole first book established God as Savior. But the whole second half of Exodus is about how is God going to dwell with His people? Like, and the whole tabernacle is this beautiful design, God's initiative, in order for Him to dwell with His people. And from this priesthood that He has established, the whole priesthood is a method God has come up with to be a God of these people, to live here and to be on the move with them, right? As they're going through the wilderness, to lead them directly, even though the sin problem is still a problem. And so you have this beautiful thing that God has created. And from this priesthood, since the law came, they were communicators of this law. Priests were often the primary teachers of God's people. But yeah, it was not, like you said, it's not, ultimately, it could not do what we needed. And I think it's interesting. You said it's the toughest pill to swallow in this chapter, and especially in the next. I just think it's really important that the Hebrews author knows what he's doing because he uses the Old Testament to make the point. Even Melchizedek was pointing to this. And in the next chapter, in Jeremiah 31, like the Hebrew scriptures are pointing to a new covenant to come, a greater covenant to come, an ultimate Messiah figure to come. And so anybody who might be tempted to say no to Christ, Hebrews 6, to be apostate, and to perhaps go back to Jewish tradition, which was more secure, had a more secure foothold in the Roman world, you might be tempted to do that. It's like, well, just so you know, your Bible says this. Hebrews is the ultimate book, chapter, and verse, even though he sometimes says, it says somewhere, it's the ultimate, so I just find that important that, yes, might be a tough pill to swallow, but I find it a powerful example of preaching and teaching that the Hebrews authors he's taking out these narratives and these passages to say, this is what God's always been preparing for.
Imagine this what Apollos did, refuting the Jews in the scriptures to show that Jesus is the Christ. I think is a little bit along those lines of what you're talking about. Yeah. Something you said that I think is true, but it also needs to go even further, is with the law and its inability to save. There's more of a problem than just our disobedience. What also is lacking is a sufficient sacrifice, in that if a man lived perfectly, that's not a replacement for Jesus. Jesus being God's only son as the sacrifice. It's like kind of like I like watching the Olympics, and I always wish for a lot of the sports, like someone from the crowd could just go out there and try, just to kind of give us a baseline. What does a normie do for like shot put, or like just to see how freakishly athletic all these other people are. Something that's huge in the book of Hebrews is that no one could replace Jesus as the sacrifice. There's something more going on than just dealing with sin. There is this establishment of Jesus on his throne and this role of mediator and priest and king, the spiritual realms being restructured. And there's more going on than just providing innocence for us. And that the garden was even a shadow. Like the garden relationship itself is a shadow, not the fulfillment of what Jesus is bringing in. So I find that very thrilling to see that things didn't start out, things were very good, but things weren't finished until they're going to be with Jesus forever. So sin is a major problem, but Jesus is accomplishing more than just dealing with sin. He's bringing abundant life. And it's like if your spouse helped cure you from cancer, that's a big deal. But you also have a life together, and life is not just about not having cancer. It's about having this love together.
Do you think a sacrifice is needed if there's no sin?
I think that there's something really profound about being a redeemed people, and that being people that are in a position by God's grace, not just by like blank creation, like created to be redeemed and having been made righteous by him, is kind of a big difference between like angels that are faithful versus us who have been bought with his blood.
My question is, do you need any of that if you've never sinned?
Well, I think you have like a child that's innocent, no sin. And I don't know how God judges that, puts the blood of Christ on a child. I trust that he does. I don't know how exactly he does that. But I think that there is in our relationship and the design of God, of having Jesus being the sacrifice to deal with sin, but also that there's that nobody else could have done that but Jesus.
Yeah. I'm just suggesting that when I say that you get rid of the sin problem, is that the Levitical priesthood and the covenant made on Sinai would have been totally sufficient if we never sinned, because sacrifices are a need for atonement. And so, if Adam and Eve never ate of the tree, theoretically, we're still chilling in the garden, But there's a sin problem that, especially as we do the prophets, like in the book of Isaiah, the farther along you go in Isaiah, the more internal you realize sin is. It's not just a collection of whoopsie daisies. It's a heart problem. In next chapter, you're going to talk about the law being written on our hearts. But to your point, I think it's so important and right to say that our sacrifice, because we have a sin problem, is more than just trying to bring us back to net zero, whatever the right neutral. It's more than a blank slate. It's full of life.
The forgiveness of sins and the gift of the Holy Spirit are equal halves of what Jesus has accomplished.
And even the intent of the first covenant was so that I can be your God and you can be my people. It was always for a life of covenant. That's what the word covenant is. It's entering into relationship. And so, yeah, it's easy to when we think about the sacrifice of Christ, it's so easy to think about kind of a legal terminology. Whether we like it or not, we are influenced dramatically by Martin Luther in the sense of like, justified by faith, and which is all true. Like we have been made right legally, but it's more than just being like innocent. Like, I'm not guilty. It's like, oh, I also have a relationship. Like, covenant is a marriage, right? With the bride of Christ. You're absolutely right. That is.
This next verse, I think, fleshes out more if we read.
Okay, so this is verse 15. This becomes even more evident when another priest arises in the likeness of Melchizedek. He was become a priest not on the basis of a legal requirement concerning bodily descent, but by the power of an indestructible life.
Yeah.
For it is witness of him, you are a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek.
So John the Baptist is, I think, a great representation of what just got described, where you have John, who's a Levite, his parents, Zechariah and Elizabeth, are serving in the temple. He's a priest. John's a priest. He's a Levite. And then he sees his kin, Jesus, walking on the horizon with Jesus of Judah. And he says, behold the Lamb of God, who puts into the world.
Mm-hmm.
Very priestly thing to say.
Yeah.
And that we recognize is, I'm not worried if I'm untying this strap of your sandal.
Yeah.
And he's like, and Jesus wants him to baptize him. And John's like, no, you should baptize me. And then Jesus tells him, no, you baptize me. And this is to fulfill all righteousness.
Mm-hmm.
And so you have really John, he's there by divine creation, just like Isaac with Abraham and Sarah. Zechariah and Elizabeth are super old, and they have John, which is like copy paste promise child stuff. And but you have Jesus's birth, which is way more like perfect. Both are miraculous, but one gets you to first base, the other one hits it off the planet.
Yeah,
like it's a huge miracle.
And John's willing to leap in the womb about it.
Yeah. And then they're in this together. One's preparing the way, one is the way. And Jesus having this dominance, this superiority, but that John is recognizing, and then baptizing Jesus, and baptism representing death, and then this resurrection, and then the Spirit coming down.
Mm-hmm.
You have this like snapshot of like the whole Bible in that moment. And I think that's what Hebrews is getting out and fleshing out here, where you have a Levitical priest and a Melchizedekian priest.
Nice.
Like next to each other. And then one is clearly like, you're the superior.
Mm-hmm.
And the other one says, we need to work together to do righteousness. And you have a sacrifice in a real system. Jesus was a legit sacrifice in the sacrificial system. And both are made by God. Both are sent by God. But one finishes the other. One prepares the way, and then the way is made. Yeah. And the way no longer needing to be prepared. It is now firmly open and established, curtain torn. We're in a whole new world now. And the hinge point of it all is what is described here, the power of an indestructible life. And that's where you get Jesus as the only begotten Son, where he's just like us. He's also one of a kind.
Both.
And that's a big head scratcher, but it's both true. And that's where our grace and redemption and hope is sourced from more than just one of us that made it.
Mm-hmm.
There's an indestructibility in Jesus' divine life that he wagers and puts at risk on the cross for our benefit. And then he's victorious to then have a legitimate way for us to have access to the Father. And Jesus says, I came that they may have life and have it abundantly. And that's not just helping us learn how to not be jerks to people. The way he gives life is in his own indestructible life and sharing that indestructible life with us, that eternal life with those who want.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting. So far, he's been really drawing from Genesis 14. But then he quotes here Psalm 110.
Yes.
The book of Psalms is the most quoted Old Testament book in the New Testament.
Big time.
And I think this is the most quoted chapter. Could be wrong. Someone could fact check me. But so it's interesting in Psalm 110, the first verse, the Lord says to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool. We know that from Acts 2, right? That's a commonly quoted verse.
And it's several times here in Hebrews in the last couple of chapters.
Yeah, so, Peter's playing on that. Like, how would David be talking to himself, pointing to something greater than him? But yeah, he refers to Melchizedek here in verse 4. The Lord has sworn, will not change his mind. You are a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. And so he quotes that here, you're a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. But in that psalm, he doesn't quote it. The Hebrews author doesn't, but he says, you have sworn, you will not change your mind, which is I guess he says it here in a second. So let me read this.
Yeah, he backtracks and
you're right. Yeah, I missed that. So I was just looking at verse 17. Yeah, but okay, this guy, he's reading backwards. That's what you do in Hebrew, right? You got to run to it. Anyway, so let me just keep reading this before I make a fool of myself.
You can just clip that. That'd be a solution to a lot of people's problems. Let me just keep reading so I don't make a fool of myself.
Yeah. That's our template. Yeah. For it is verse 17. For it is witness of him, you are a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. For on the one hand, a former commandment is set aside because of its weakness and uselessness. For the law made nothing perfect. But on the other hand, a better hope is introduced through which we draw near to God. And it was not without an oath. For those who formerly became priests were made such without an oath. But this one was made a priest with an oath by the one who said to him, the Lord has sworn and will not change his mind. You are a priest forever. This makes Jesus the guarantor of a better covenant.
Mm-hmm. Here's the big verses.
Yeah. Do you want to keep going, or is that a good?
No, it's a digest. These are really, really big verses. If you want to draw near to God, you're only going to draw near to him through Jesus. He's this priest is the bridge. And if you're trying to draw near to God through some other means, it's going to not work.
Yeah.
You only got one way, one narrow way to God, and it's through Jesus in this role as a.
Yeah. And real quick before we keep going, it's important for us to also know that the term draw near in the book of Hebrews, is referring to a term used a lot in the Old Testament about not just a general, like, I'm going to come to God in prayer, but it's talking about tabernacle/temple worship. The process of drawing near was going from the populace to the courtyard, to the holy place, to the Holy of Holies. Drawing near was a worship term. And we saw that, drawing near with confidence in chapter 4. Yeah. So keep going. I just want to make that note that he's using
worship language, and you have right standing with God.
Yeah.
It's appropriate to draw near.
It's appropriate in the context of talking about a priesthood.
Yeah. So with this idea of him swearing, this is what I was saying earlier. Like, this is where you're seeing God's brushstrokes, like the work of his hands. This is where God rolls up his sleeves. It's like, I'm going in, and he's doing something. Mm-hmm. It's like taking the universe and crafting and bending reality, fixing things. And it's amazing because God can do a lot. Mm-hmm. You can do anything that just about, unless he makes a promise and say, I'm never going to do anything like this again.
Yeah.
Then he's gonna put restrictions on himself. So God,
crazy to think about.
So God, I think you and I talked about this in our last conversation about Moses intervening on the mountain with God, and God wanting to pour out wrath and nuke the rest of the Israelites, except for Moses. And God could have been just in doing that and then raising up family from Moses and going from there. But God, he gives and takes away. He could be like, here's a priesthood, and the priesthood's done. He could have done that. And I'm going to wipe this nation out. I'm going to raise this nation up. But when there's several moments in scriptures and covenants and some promises, like, I'm going to put this rainbow in the sky, never going to flood the earth again like this. There's certain things where it's like, this has happened, this is never going to happen again. And God is super active. He's always doing stuff in the scriptures. So many miracles, so many moments. But there's few moments where things get changed permanently. And this is one of them. He swears, you are a priest forever. So it's just like, this is something that is not just going to serve a moment or a century or people for 1,000 years. This is now a forever norm. It's kind of like when Nebuchadnezzar or Darius with like Esther or Daniel, you have kings who make laws and then they have to be held accountable to their own laws and create some different drama or moments. It's like that, but on the highest scale, but in a positive way, where the God Almighty has put in place not just something for a time, but for all time.
Mm-hmm.
And that Jesus is a priest forever, and he swears by himself. We don't swear. When we our swearing is basically crude curse words. We don't like do oaths and swears very much in our society. It's something we're warned about doing with not swearing. But God taking this oath, this and swearing by himself in this way is helping us trust and understand that Jesus is in this role is an eternal dynamic. And it really shuts down any sort of idea of a new gospel, new revelations, that there's been a change with our relationship with God after Jesus. When Jesus is hanging on the cross, he yells, "It's finished." And that's a big period to a long story for what God has done in this. And so I find this to be very compelling. And that's why verse 22, Jesus is this guarantor of this better covenant. It's like, in case you missed it, and everything's this makes Jesus a better, this makes him the guarantor of this better covenant, because it is so foolproof. Because Jesus' establishment as priest, I can't, no matter how stupid I am or rebellious or evil I become, I can't change what God has done. Like, you could maybe nuke the region of Israel and turn it into a big lake. The promised land could become a deep sea exploration spot. The planet could blow up, whatever. But Jesus being a priest after the order of Melchizedek, untouchable. And so it's foolproof, and I'm pretty foolish at times. And it's so important to understand that the way this relationship works, its strength is not based off of my performance.
So the new covenant is the better covenant because it's the final covenant.
It's final, and it is fully optimized. It's not just like slightly better. It's completely competent to accomplish God's will.
Yeah. I see a connection here in verse 18 and 19. Relating to verse 19, we says, but on the other hand, a better hope is introduced through which we draw near to God.
Yes.
I see that connected to the end of chapter 6, verse 19 and 20. We have this as a sure and steadfast anchor of the soul, a hope that enters into the inner place behind the curtain, where Jesus has gone as a forerunner on our behalf, having become a high priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. So again, like our last episode, talking about this, Jesus, our hope, enters into the actual holy place, sits at the right hand of God, immovable, and he serves as our anchor. And so it's his presence and his steadfastness sworn in by an oath from God that makes this the final, permanent, ultimate covenant.
I have a somewhat secret project that's having me focus a lot on Genesis and the pre-flood world. And one of the questions that arises in my mind is like, why didn't Eden just like disappear? Why does he leave Eden hard and guarded for over 1,000 years up until the flood? And just thinking about what implications would having a cherubim with a flaming sword with the garden you were collectively kicked out of, what would that do to people's minds and hearts? And like, why, God is love, so why would he do that? Like, why give a perimeter in this way? And one of the things that, and just reflecting on that, is recognizing that there is distance, there is separation, like that God's goodness is still present. And so there's a kind of a symbol of hope that even if you're not in Eden still exists.
Mm-hmm.
Like there is still God's presence. You may not be in that presence, but you know that there was a place you did belong, and you're not just lost in absolute chaos. There's chaos in your life, but just knowing that there's order out there is a modicum of hope in one's life. And I think that gets kind of to the next level for the Israelites, where life is crazy, but we have a temple where God lives. God's in there. Am I able to go inside the temple? Not all the way, but I can get closer and I can get halfway into it. And some of us once a year can go into having represent me, which is a really big deal. So there is some hope in that. Like, look, God gave us a law. And it comes to like, there's some hope in that. But then there's this better hope of you getting to not just go into the holy place of the temple, but to actually approach the very throne of God in reality.
With confidence.
There's a confidence and with legitimacy forever, and death is no longer an issue. Like, so the better hope is not just like a slight upgrade. It is like this profound new dynamic, but you see these kind of these phases of drawing nearer to God right out from the garden. The garden exists as this reminder, hey, there's still hope, but now there's the best hope has shown up.
Yeah. And you would think that this would be a great place for the author to end his uninspired chapter, but he just keeps going with this thought, right?
He doubles down.
Yeah, 23. The former priests were many in number because they were prevented by death.
Death.
Yeah, it gets in the way all the time from continuing office, but he holds his priesthood permanently because he continues forever. Consequently, he is able to save to the uttermost those who draw near to God through him, since he always lives to make intercession for them. For it was indeed fitting that we should have such a high priest, holy, innocent, unstained, separated from sinners, and exalted above the heavens. He has no need, like those high priests, to offer sacrifices daily, first for his own sins, then for those of the people, since he did this once for all when he offered up himself. For the law appoints men in their weakness as high priest, but the word of the oath, which came later than the law, appoints his son, who has been made perfect forever.
Yeah, it's awesome.
So death gets in the way for these former priests, but not so for the son.
Yeah, that's why in the order of Melchizedek, it's a priesthood that lasts forever. It's a lifelong role. And perks of living forever is you get to have the role for forever. And Jesus is eternal, and that makes him just completely uniquely qualified for this position. He's not just like the best at it amongst us. It's like he fully rounds out the position and is just completely competent. And he's priest in this function for eternity. And it's a hat he's never going to take off. I love this language. This was a big point in the lesson we did. This idea of him saving to the uttermost. Just really camping on that a lot. That he doesn't just deal with the big sins in your life, but he fills you with righteousness all the way to the brim and it overflows. He doesn't just balance the books. He makes it extremely lopsided in terms of grace. And this language here I found very challenging, where he says, he saves to the uttermost those who draw near to God through him. So he's, like First John talks about that he paid for the sins of the whole world. So like Jesus paid for everybody, whether they want him or not. But he saves those who draw near to God through him. And so that made me pose a question to the church of just like, is that you? Are you drawing near to God through Jesus? And you have to decide if you're going to be in that camp or not. But he saves to the uttermost is such a powerful phrase of, again, First John, First John 3:20, even if our heart condemns us, God is greater than our heart. He knows everything. And there's that our emotional life, our spiritual life have a lot of overlap, but they're not the same thing. and our emotions, thank God, are not the authority for our salvation. And our saving to the uttermost is sourced in Jesus and his role as priest and sacrifice, not based off of how I'm feeling.
Mm-hmm.
And man, that, like, in him knowing everything, like, our heart can condemn us. I can look in the mirror and think, I'm a worm, I'm dirt, I'm trash. Satan's always so effective at, like, go ahead and do the thing. And then when you do it, it's like, why'd you do it? And then you're just like, I'm just rubbish. And Jesus can look at me in my state of self-imposed rubbishness.
Mm-hmm.
And like verse 320 or chapter 320, First John, he knows everything. He knows he's saved to the uttermost, even when I forget I'm saved to the uttermost. And so I find it so inspiring. The extent of the saving is not just when I believe it. It's I'm saved because he's accomplished it.
Mm-hmm.
And that is, that's like when I'm faithless, he remains faithful. And there is a way of having a hard heart, like we talked about last week. But this is a very different type of dynamic where the salvation is the work of his hands, not just a state of mind. Mm-hmm. I have to have 24/7.
Yeah. I was looking up other translations of this verse, and several have uttermost, some have completely, fully. Some say like at all times. And so I just find it interesting. I remember having a conversation with a teenager years ago out at our church camp, who was thinking about being baptized, but he said, Jeff, like, what if I sin again?
Right. It's a normal question.
Do I need to get baptized again? And then sin again? And get baptized again? Well, what I find interesting, when we see this elsewhere, we see the sufficiency of Christ's death in Romans 6 and how we are declared. Therefore, you must consider yourselves dead to sin, alive to God, not constantly having more sacrifices, baptized every single time you sin. 1 John 1:7, that he continually cleanses us from all sin. I just find this interesting, this idea of salvation being an ongoing thing, that sometimes I get trapped into this line of thinking that Jesus saved me at one time and now I'm on my own. It's like every day is a rescue mission. Every day he is interceding on my behalf. I can walk away from that. I can abandon him. If I abandon him, Hebrews 6, I abandon my anchor. I abandon my high priest. I have no one interceding for me. But if I'm drawing near, if I'm falling forward, there's a sense of he saves me every time, every day. That is uttermost. Like his salvation is so full, so complete. It's always ready.
You can't exaggerate how much he saves you.
Yeah.
Because like we talked about before, it's not once saved, barely saved.
Yeah.
And next couple chapters, we'll get into it, where he saves us even more from just sin. So just a quick little plug for that teaser. But this verse 2, at the beginning of this Save to the Uttermost, it starts with this is another challenging word I took away from this chapter. It starts with consequently. Yeah. And I was just like, I need to think like that a lot more. Because he's a priesthood of Melchizedek, makes this big point, and then consequently, he's able to save to the uttermost. And I just was like, if I thought like that more, what a radical different view of the world I would have, where you look at what God does, and then you just think, what are the consequences of what God has done? Mm-hmm. And then, whoa, like that just lands you such in a different place. Because most of my prayers tend to be like, God, help me with my personal whatever, instead of considering the works of his hands. Not just like, wow, God, you made the stars. They're beautiful. Well done. 10 out of 10 would recommend.
Not leaving a Yelp review.
When you realize, wow, Jesus is a priest after the order of Melchizedek forever. You swore that. And just, you think consequently, just like you kind of, in your own words, write out, what are the consequences? What has God accomplished in blank?
It's the implications.
Yeah. And then just like, whoa, it just helps you see God's will and what he's after and his track record and his thoroughness. Mm-hmm. And then you start seeing how that has radically affected your world. And it's much more interesting. And surprisingly, believe it or not, God's a lot more interesting than I am.
Oh, yeah.
And when my prayers start becoming more about him than about me, it's much better.
It's interesting. This is where my brain went, but it's one of the basic rules of writing is to be mindful of not using the same word over and over and over. And he's already used therefore many times. Also, mix it up. Consequently, well, he pulled out the thesaurus maybe, but it's the same idea. It's therefore, since what God has done in Christ, this is, and thinking of our faith and our salvation in those terms of not just what God has done, but what God is doing through Christ. And that's what this chapter is about. Presently, he's always available. And I think that's one of the most fascinating parts of the book of Hebrews is it's not just looking back to what God has done in Jesus, but what God is doing in 2025 through Christ, our high priest.
Yes.
So as we end here, what stands out in verse 26 and following, talking about him, what he means for describing him as our high priest. These words: holy, innocent, unstained, separated from sinners. I'm just curious. How did you end this chapter, this sermon?
Trying to drive home that truth is enthroned and is victorious. And so, kind of like in Revelation, how Jesus rides out in a white horse, like things are, when they're wrapped up, Jesus has already been victorious. And his victory changes life today.
Yeah.
Kind of what you were talking about just a minute ago. And so no matter what happens on the planet, no matter what wars are or aren't happening, or whatever chaos or trauma or strife, tribulations people go through, Jesus' enthronement and priesthood is present and over it all and affecting how we live today. And so he's worthy to worship. He's reasonable to hope in. And our faith is not blind. It's bold. We look back at the cross and the empty tomb, and that was where everything changed. But that change affects me and you and everyone else today and forever. It's finished, and it's created a new norm that we are to be confident in because of what he's done. And so that maturity, like we talked about last episode, you can have real maturity by seeing and living off the fact of Jesus and his position. And so the promise and blessing of God, the promise and blessing from him was not just a parcel of land in the Middle East.
Yeah.
The promise God and the blessing for God was for us to have this kind of relationship with him forever. And it begins with what Jesus has done on the cross, or what he's done for us in these years we have. This world really has nothing to satisfy us. There's nothing that's going to fill our hearts sufficiently. He's coming. Ecclesiastes is all vanity, it's striving to win. He's putting God's put eternity in our hearts.
Yeah.
But we can't quite grasp it by ourselves. There's a shadow, and there's this longing, and Jesus is the only portion for your soul.
That's right.
He's the only thing that really answers all the questions.
That's right. Well, thank you so much for joining us today in this episode, and we hope it was an encouragement to you, and I know it was fun for us to work through this chapter. Just remember that he's writing for a purpose, this letter, and that is not just for the original audience, but for us to remember we have a high priest standing next to the Father, constantly interceding for us. And so let's take advantage of that, right? Let's be approaching the throne with confidence, the throne of grace with confidence, because we have Jesus who is permanently and forever established as our high priest. So please like this episode, comment any questions you have, any topics, anything that come up in your study of this chapter. Feel free to share with your friends. We'll see you next time.